It is a great pleasure for me to be here this afternoon and to have a chance to introduce my friend and colleague, Alex Gorsky, Chairman of the Board and Chief Executive of J&J. Since 2010, Alex has been leading a very special company. Of course, one of the great global healthcare companies, but I think, as all of you know, even more so, one of the most respected companies in the world, with one of the most respected brands in the world. J&J is a company that for more than 100 years has been admired for really one basic reason. Its core ethic is always to do the right thing for patients and always to deliver products to their customers and patients that they can trust. For a healthcare company, there's really no more important mantra. And I think much to their credit, even in the toughest times, under the toughest circumstances, the leadership and employees of J&J have stayed true to that core vision. J&J to me is also a fascinating company because in many ways it's bucked the recent trend in the healthcare industry to specialize. So unlike many of its peers who decided to become device-focused or pharma-focused or consumer products-focused, J&J has actually successfully maintained both its widespread diversification but also its leadership in all three areas: consumer products, pharmaceuticals, and devices. Alex is absolutely an ideal leader for this large and diversified company as it evolves into what is clearly an increasingly complex future in global healthcare. He graduated from West Point. He spent more than 20 years at J&J, where he held positions of increasing responsibility in sales, marketing, and management on both the device side of the business and the pharma side of the business. But I think more importantly, as a leader, he has continually demonstrated that you can do well by doing good, which is the same as that basic mantra of the J&J culture. He's widely acknowledged in the industry for his inspirational leadership style, his commitment to diversity and inclusion. He was named one of the 100 most inspiring leaders by Pharma Voice. And under his leadership, J&J has received both the Corporate Leadership Award of the Thomas Mannion Foundation and the Corporate Humanitarian Award from Operation Smile. Outside of J&J, Alex serves on a number of corporate boards, including IBM, the National Academy Foundation, and the Congressional Medal of Honor. This morning, he's going to talk to us about healthcare, society's great challenge. Today, as all of you know, we're really at a crossroads in healthcare. On the one hand, the science has never been better, not even close. And because of that, I think we're poised on the threshold of a revolution which over the next 10 to 20 years is going to produce new cures for diseases like Alzheimer's, cancer, and diabetes. But at the same time, we're faced with the challenges of paying for these advances and making sure that we continue to provide access to them for patients around the world, in both the developing countries and the developed countries. I look forward to hearing Alex's insights on these opportunities and challenges this morning. Please join me in welcoming him to the stage. Alex?
Wow, Jeff, thank you very much for that generous introduction. I know if my mother was here, she'd be the only person in the room shaking her head in complete agreement with what you were saying. But it's great to be here with such a great example, I think, of what leadership in our industry does. And I think the work that you and your colleagues have done at Vertex has been nothing less than spectacular. And thank you so much again for those kind words. But it's a real pleasure to be here today. I'd like to start actually also by acknowledging 911. I don't know about you, but I always have a kind of a special place in my heart on this day for a number of reasons. And having had the privilege and the honor to serve in the United States Army in particular, I can't think of more important day to remember all those brave young men and women who have done so much. We all remember the greatest generation. I got to tell you, I think the last couple generations have definitely done more than their part. And without them, there's no way we could be here to have events like this and do some of the great things that all of you do as CEOs, as business leaders, and academic leaders, and so many other areas, here in the Boston area. So thanks to all of them as well. But before I get into maybe some comments about the heavier topic of healthcare and what I think, I thought I'd start a little bit about Johnson & Johnson. And the way I'll start, now most of you are sitting out there thinking, Johnson & Johnson. What do they do? And I'll bet, in fact, when I say the word baby powder, or words baby powder, or baby shampoo, let me see a show of hands. How many of you can actually smell it as I say it? Is that a great brand? Or what, huh? I mean, there's something about that. There's something very ephemeral that, very early on. And, we are incredibly proud of that tradition and some of the products that were created at the very beginning of our company. In fact, our company started in the late 1880s by the Johnson brothers. It's kind of an interesting story. They were actually going to pharmacy school up near Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania. And I'll give you the short version. They opened up the paper one day and they said, hey, there's this thing called the World's Fair that they're going to be having down in Philadelphia. And so they said, well, let's jump on there and we'll get on this train and see what's new in the medical world. And they did. And while they were there happened to be this guy by the name of Lister from the UK. Now stick with me on Lister because it comes full circle. And what he was there talking about, and remember this was in the late 1880s, and there was a lot of new thinking, research being done into why did we have such bad outcomes in surgery? Why did people die? And of course, at that time, it wasn't necessarily surgery, and in the wars, it wasn't from the wounds themselves, but it was from the infections afterwards. And they really didn't fully understand microbes at the time and why that was the genesis of the infections. But Lister gave a talk that if you kept a surgical field sterile, you could have better outcomes. And he presented some data. And these two guys said, you know what? It's a lot better than filling, pills in a pharmacy. Maybe we should think about starting up a business. And they started by coming up with a process to make sterile gauze. And that's the way the company got started. And it started right on the banks of the Raritan River in New Jersey. And, it's interesting what a lot of people don't know. There was actually a third brother that, like a lot of family businesses, couldn't quite work it out. He ended up heading to the Midwest and he started SC Johnson, the Johnson Wax Company. And but the two Johnson brothers stayed together, and they started there, and they went from gauze to talc. They knew that those days they used to use a lot of plaster for different kinds of wounds, and the talc would help with the plaster. And they thought, would that work on a baby's bottom? The next thing you know, we had baby powder. And from there, the company grew, went into sutures, took on a number of businesses, and what we're incredibly proud of, in the late 50s, we got into the pharmaceutical industry with the purchase of McNeil Pharmaceutical, and then later Janssen, a very prolific drug discovery organization out of Europe. We've been able to introduce products like oral contraceptives that frankly changed the way women could think about managing their life. Families could be managed in different ways. And along the way, we also got into the medical device business. So today, we're about $75 billion in annual revenues. We're one of the top 10 pharmaceutical companies in the world. We get to work with and compete with Jeff and others every day. That's right, in the pursuit of new treatments that are going to help people live longer, healthier, and happier lives. We're in immunology, neuroscience, infectious disease, a number of different areas. We're also in the medical device industry. Another question, how many of you have ever had a stitch, a suture in you? Okay, there's about an 85% chance that we are part of your body. Johnson & Johnson. That's one of our largest businesses. And it's fun, when I first came back from the pharmaceutical side to the device side, I entered into Ethicon. And it's amazing when you talk to surgeons, and some of the surgeons who are here probably can relate to this, and you talk about Ethicon suture, their hands go like this because they actually have the feel for exactly the way it should be used in the operating room. But we make contact lenses, we make knees, we make hips, we make shoulders. We're in the diabetes test strip business, a very large business there. And then, of course, we have our consumer brands that you all know and love so well. Things like Neutrogena, things like Avito, the Band-Aid, and interestingly enough, Listerine, which we purchased at an acquisition from Pfizer about 10 years ago. So it really did go full circle from how the company started to the fact that we have Listerine today. A great brand, great product, and certainly something that we're very interested in globalizing. Now, while I'm incredibly proud of the products and the technologies, the coolest part of my job is I get to walk in a room every day with scientists and researchers where I can be in one room and we're talking about, a new monoclonal antibody that's going to be used on the CD38 receptor. And then I walk into the next room and they're showing me polymers that are going to be used as a scaffolding to help regenerate bone tissue. And then I walk into the next room and I get to hear about the advertisement for Neutrogena, and should it be Jennifer Aniston or should it be somebody else? And so the array of technologies and the diversities of business just really keep it interesting. And I mean, I pinch myself every day, and I'm honored and humbled to be able to represent such an organization around the world. But I think what I'm most proud of is that ethos, a very important document called our Credo, and a little bit of history on it. So for about the first 60 years of the company, it was pretty much a family-owned company. And Robert Wood Johnson was the son of the founder and had been the CEO for quite some time. And he was a pretty progressive thinker. In some ways, he could be, right of Attila the Hun. In other ways, he could be the most progressive, the most liberal-minded business leader, and nobody could quite peg him. On one hand, he did not like the government interfering in business. On the other hand, he stood hard and fast for a very high minimum wage as they came out of the Depression. And as he was thinking about the philosophy and the important role that business had in a post-Depression period in the United States, he started developing a set of principles that he felt were very good for the company to think about, and he wanted to introduce it to the management team. But more importantly, on the eve of the company going public, he was very concerned, frankly, that the company would lose its heart and soul. It had been a family company. He felt he could make strong stands on principles. And so as the company went public, he took the time to write this document in his longhand. That's the Johnson & Johnson that you see. And it was our Credo, and it's a quite simple document. I think it's about 143 words. And it starts with a commitment to patients, consumers. What I always found it interesting, you can talk about patients and consumers, but it really gets personal when you say mom and dad. And he actually used those words, mothers and fathers, in the first line, that we always make sure we have products of the highest quality that ultimately help them. In the second paragraph, he talked about a commitment to employees. Now remember, this was in the late 1930s, early 40s. And you didn't necessarily have the best relationship between management and employees all the time. And he talked about it, and employees having a place for a decent work environment, a safe work environment, one where they could be nurtured for the future. And that was progressive. The third paragraph blew a lot of people away because he talked about your responsibility to the communities in which we live and serve. And again, this was long before this was a common, where everybody had corporate social responsibility, as we should. But to think that at that time he thought about, what are we giving back to the communities, those who are less fortunate than we are? How can we make sure, and in fact his statement was, we have to earn the right to exist in a community as we run our businesses. And then he said, and if we do those things, our shareholders should get a fair return. And he actually put the shareholder last, and it's pretty interesting because he owned about 50% of Johnson & Johnson shares at the time. And what I can tell you is that we use that each and every day. We don't always get it right. Like many companies, we've got plenty of examples, but what I can tell you is that even last year on the 71st anniversary of Johnson & Johnson, we asked all of our employees to participate in tables about the size that you're on right now in a Credo challenge, where we went through it line by line and said, what does that mean to you today? And at the end, we actually included some examples where we misstepped, we made mistakes. That really brings it to life when you say, it's one thing to talk about principles here, it's another to say, you're in China, the distributor just asked you for a payment to go here, or you're in this country, what do you do? How do you bring that to life? And I can tell you, the level of engagement and recommitment that it provided has really been amazing. And including all the way to our board, we went through the same exercise. So it's who we are, and it's certainly something that we're very proud of. Now let me maybe just switch gears here a little bit and talk about the healthcare environment, because I agree. I can't quote Voltaire, but I'll do Dickens and say, I think it's a little bit of the best of times and a little bit of the worst of times. And let me start maybe with the negative so I can end on an upswing. And you don't fall asleep with a postprandial lull after eating such a great lunch. But some of it starts, unfortunately, with the fact that we're all living longer. And beyond that, it's a little bit of math. So let me talk you through that. If you think about the next several decades in the United States and around the world, the average age of the population the number of people over the age of 65 is going to increase dramatically. So some examples. Right now, about 12 to 15% of the population in the United States is over the age of 65. That number is going to go to 22 to 25% over the next 30 years. That means 35 million to 70 million. If you're in places like Japan, they're already at over 20% of their population. That number is going to go to 40% of their population over the next 30 years. And if you're in France, if you're in Germany, if you're in the UK, you're not far behind. It's estimated that their populations will be somewhere between 25 and 30% because of the World War II dynamic. And it's not only in the developed markets. If you go to the developing markets, China right today has got about 150 million people over the age of 65. That number is going to 350 million. Think about that for a minute. A population the size of the United States of people over the age of 65. Now, one of the big challenges associated with that is you tend to consume about 5 to 7 times the amount of health care after the age of 65 that you do before 65. And so the good news is people are living longer, they're living healthier lives, but the facts are they're going to be consuming a lot more in terms of health care. Now, the other big dynamic is a rising middle class. You know, we're fortunate, very fortunate in this country, even with all the challenges that we have in our healthcare system, to generally be able to have access. But around the world, it's a different situation. And we can have a long debate later about what percent of our GDP should we spend. And is it 18% the right number here in the US? Probably not. Is 2%, 3% that you see in a lot of the developing countries right? Probably not. And in these countries, so often, once you have put shelter over their head, once you have food on the table, what's the third next item that they want more of as they move up the economic ladder? It's healthcare. And so as you see the middle class in China go from 200 to 300 million people to 700 to 800 million people, and you multiply that across ASEAN and a lot of other places, you can see why over the past several years we've been dealing with a very uncertain economic environment. And I would argue that underlying that, a lot of it has to do with the underlying cost of entitlements, one of them being health care going forward, and the pressure that that is going to put on economies, on payers, on governments around the world. And a lot of that boils down to just basic math. Now, what's some of the good news? Why should we not, get too down the dumps? Why should we look forward? Very consistent with what Jeff said. I can't think of a more exciting time to be living today in terms of scientific breakthroughs and innovation than what we're seeing. Just this morning, I had the pleasure to visit. We opened up an innovation center here in Boston, not too far from here. And by the way, let me thank you very much for the ecosystem that you've created. I mean, the capabilities, the raw intelligence, the skills that Boston provides to the greater healthcare community is nothing less than remarkable. Anymore, yes, we do research and development, but we do much more what we call search and development. Even a company our size, we can't discover everything. Rather, you've got to go out and you've got to build the networks, work with the academic centers, work with the venture world, do it early to identify that next breakthrough opportunity. Many times we're larger companies, like Jeff's and mine, where we can actually scale it, bring it to fruition, and be able to take it globally. And by having an innovation center here, and when you were listening to the ideas that they were presenting, they were talking about the microbiome this morning and how there's flora and fauna inside of us, and I know it's just after lunch, so I won't get into the other parts of that have the potential to take on inflammatory diseases in the future because it's actually regulated by what's going on in your gut. It can take on obesity, certain aspect of metabolic disease, just by better understanding something like that. They showed us a new platform that can help regenerate bone by fusing two things together in trauma surgery. And I think back, and I've been able to be a student of this industry for some time, the breakthroughs that we've had, the billions of dollars of investments that have been made, understanding the genome, and what that is resulting in terms of productivity across areas like hepatology, like oncology and neuroscience is remarkable. And I really believe we're on that cusp now, like a new inflection point, where for many years I think there were a lot of critics of the pharmaceutical industry that said you do a lot of Me Too drugs. and there's not differentiation, and you think about some of the breakthroughs that we've had and that we're in the process of delivering, it's nothing less than remarkable. Now, I also think beyond the health sciences technology, it's going to be incredibly exciting to take some of the technology that we tend to associate with Silicon Valley and right here in Boston, and how do we merge these things together? Working in the device industry right now, we make some incredible instruments that help cut and coagulate, that get people walking again with prosthetic devices. I would predict 10 or 20 years from now, we'll look back and say, oh my gosh, can you believe how basic some of those things were? Because when we can take some of the technology that we have around sensing, data aggregation, real-time visioning, the ability to do instantaneous search intra-surgery, during surgery, and merge these technologies, I would say 10 years from now, we won't have any dumb instruments. They'll all be smart instruments. They'll all be integrated in ways that we frankly can't even imagine today. And I also think bringing the idea of convergent science together. Sometimes people look at me, and of course we're always asked the question, you're a pharmaceutical company, you're a medical device company, and you're a consumer company. I say we're a healthcare company. A patient doesn't care if it's a device or a drug, they want to be cured. And I think going forward, bringing unique approaches in medicine where you're combining drug and devices with unique delivery options will bring about options and therapies and cures that, again, today we can't quite imagine. I also think there's a big inflection point and a reason to be positive around the impact with consumerism will have on healthcare. Growing up, when my parents went to the physician, they weren't in the medical field, what the doctor said pretty much went. And that was their only channel into healthcare was vis-a-vis that physician. And you think with the internet, with the ubiquity of information that is now available to consumers, we have much more informed consumers. And I know a little knowledge can be a dangerous thing at times. So it needs to be done the right way. But whether it's the amount of information that consumers have, whether it's the fact that more and more consumers are actually sharing in healthcare costs in one way or another, the impact that consumerism will have, and I think in the long run will actually raise the standard in medicine, can be a very positive thing if done in the right way. And last but not least, and I'll have time to take some of your questions, I think there's other opportunities and reasons to be optimistic. And certainly, one for me begins with the importance of taking care of ourselves. I'm fortunate to work for a company that produces over 330,000 SKUs on any given time. That touches about every part of your body. And while I'm really proud of those, in some ways, to solve this big healthcare challenge that we face, how we take care of ourselves, how we try to stay healthy, how do we try to prevent disease from happening in the first place, I believe is also going to be a very important part of managing healthcare around the globe. And I think it's particularly important for all of you CEOs sitting in this room. Like many, you're in these jobs, it's not unusual where you're traveling, you're working all day, you get on the plane at night, you're traveling all night, you walk into the next meeting and you're there, the diet's not quite what it should be, the stress is high in today's world, the margin of error, is pretty tight, and next thing you know, you're 30, the next thing you know, you're 40, the next thing you know, you're 50 and 60 and 70, and if you're not taking care of yourselves, what you find over time, I don't care how good your genes are, things will start to happen. And so one of the things that we spend a lot of time with at J&J, but even broadly in healthcare systems, is how can we bring wellness and prevention and make it a more important component? So much, it's estimated in certain cases up to 75% of the diseases that we're dealing with, a significant percentage of that is impacted by our behavior. Things like smoking, things like what we're eating, things like our activity level. And so I realize it's we've actually got into the health business and the wellness business. It's difficult. There's a gym on every corner. There's a diet every day. But in some way, we believe that that's got to be incorporated in as part of the overall solution. And by the way, I would also recommend for all of you as business leaders, take the time to take care of yourselves. You don't want to put in all those hours through your career, retire thinking you've finally done it, and have some untoward health event that we can't take care of, and your family doesn't get a chance to enjoy that time with you as they should. So with that, thank you very much for a wonderful lunch, a great venue with that big V in the background. And I'll be happy to take any of your questions or your comments. Thank you very much, everybody. Here we go. Yes.
Great presentation.
Thank you, Darren.
It's such a brave new world.
There's a microphone, I think, right behind you.
It's such a fascinating. Does this work? I think you have to be in that table
Gotcha.
to get a live mic. You talked about these smart devices. How does privacy, protecting people, cybersecurity, all these threats, as this starts to get integrated, does your company play a role in that, do you think? How do we protect people?
Yeah. Look, it's a great question. As we all know, whenever you create a new breakthrough, it's always going to create consequences, sometimes unintended, that we have to think about. And the whole issue one area that I was looking at my watch, I didn't want to go on too much longer, otherwise I would get the hook, is I think a big opportunity is how do we better integrate data in managing healthcare. And yes, healthcare, as the physicians in this room would tell you, there is a lot of art to healthcare, but we can definitely do a better job on the science side by aggregating more data and really understanding what's going on. And I think the opportunity, in my role, being able to see at Johnson & Johnson some of the things that we're doing in healthcare, sitting on the board at IBM, when we can take DNA profile, when we can merge that with an electronic medical health record, and then track that real time with other molecular diagnostics that we'll be using with the patient, and we can actually target a specific therapeutic intervention to increase the outcome, improve the outcome, the effectiveness, reduce the side effects. What a wonderful opportunity that could be. And that, I don't think that is necessarily rocket science 20 or 30 years from now. The challenge is, how do we integrate all that data in a way that protects the patient, that's not misused? And I don't have all those answers today. And I think it's going to take a lot of great thinking, a lot of great work so that it's done in an appropriate manner, that protects the integrity of the data. I mean, in our case right now, most of the data issues that we're dealing with have to do with clinical trial data that customers submit to us when they, participate in certain programs. So it's nowhere near as massive as like some of the banks in the other areas. But I think going forward, the healthcare ecosystem is going to deal more and more with that, and doing it in a very thoughtful, deliberate, and well-considered way is going to be more important than ever. Other questions, comments? Yes, sir.
Hi. By way of background, I've been in the biopharmaceutical industry for about 35, 40 years, a big supporter of it. But as we're heading into this presidential campaign period, the industry has a big target on its back. Everybody is going after the industry. And I think the industry's reputation has suffered a great deal in the past decade or so. A lot of the criticisms are unfair. Many of them are untrue. But for the most part, people believe them, people unaware of what the industry really does and the challenges it faces. And I think reputation has a big impact, potential impact on intellectual property and the kind of patent lives we'll end up getting, pricing of drugs, et cetera. What do you think J&J and others should be doing to improve on that?
Yeah, wow, that's a loaded question. I probably need another cup of coffee before I go with you. But and especially when you started off by talking about the political season, because you're right, it's getting very ripe. Look, I think that there's a lot of things that we face into, and I think, one of the most important things we can do is continue to focus on innovation that really improves patients' lives. I mean, I think the thing that we do best as an industry is take science, and translate that into clinical outcomes that ultimately can be put in the physician's hands, the patient's hands, and that results in them being better. And when we lose focus on that, that's when we have a challenge. But there's no doubt that going forward, our society is going to have to wrestle with some of these big issues, as I was talking about. And one of the facts I know is that even if we decide that we want to fix healthcare costs at a certain level right now, if you do some of the math that I was talking about earlier, if we don't find a cure or a therapeutic improvement for Alzheimer's, even if we hold everything constant, we are going to have a massive problem just because of the math. So I think it's going to take a right level of innovation, and I realize innovation, it's easy for us being up here as a healthcare executive to say that innovation doesn't cure everything, but it's going to take more innovation. It's going to take, I believe, more coordination of care. I think the other factor that we'll be moving to, frankly, are new business models where episodes of care and outcomes are actually paid for and rewarded versus more of a line item approach for an activity or just a process. And I think we as the industry need to participate in that. I think we need to be part of that dialogue, and I've been very much encouraged. Several other CEOs just recently were speaking with Secretary Burwell about this very issue. And unfortunately, there are certain characteristics of the current system that actually prevent you to even piloting and going into those modes, and that we've got to be able to work through in a pragmatic way that always protects the patient, but that also, get us out of just looking on what I'd call a straight fee-for-service, straight per diem approach, and look for some of these, more outcome, more episode of care approaches that consider the total cost of healthcare. I mean, in the end, likely living longer will cost more. And how we deal with that as a society is certainly not something that I can solve, or I think we're going to have to work collectively to figure that out. Yes, sir.
Fascinated with your comments on wellness and prevention. As you know, we're willing apparently to spend endless amounts of money on medicine. We spend almost nothing on public health comparatively, or wellness and prevention efforts. So I'd love you to say a little bit more about what Johnson & Johnson is doing in that realm. Sure. But beyond that, what you think it's going to take for us to really get the buy-in to those aspects of the strategy overall.
Yeah, thank you. We've had a little bit of a pilot laboratory, you might say, in our own employee base. And Jim Burke, who was the predecessor of my predecessor of my predecessor, CEO, who was a remarkable leader, was a big believer in health and wellness, and started some of the very initial programs. And this was back in the 70s, putting healthcare facilities in some of our plants. They put gyms in them, would encourage people. We call them Live for Life points. If you worked out in the gym, you got Live for Life points where you could go in the company store and get something for free. And they're pretty rudimentary, but he had the right idea. And through the years, we've tried to build on that with more scientific study and background. And now we actually have an entire group looking at how do we keep our own employees healthier. We're convinced that a healthier employee is going to be more engaged, is going to be more productive, is going to be happier, more engaged, and ultimately do better, personally and professionally. And what we've been able to demonstrate is that when we invest in things like smoking cessation programs, when we invest in really good prenatal care, when we get a patient much better educated in controlling things like type 2 diabetes, when we help them make decisions, particularly when they're facing areas like very serious cancer care, that you do get better outcomes. And we find that for about every dollar we invest, we get a return of about $4. If we look at our average healthcare costs per employee, our rates of increase, actually they're lower than the benchmarks for the industry. And when we look at our levels of engagement in our employees, which we survey every 2 years, we've also seen a correlation there where they feel better. And very often, in fact, just in a couple of weeks, I'll be with another group of CEOs that are working with the American Heart Association. And I know many of your companies, by the way, do different elements of that. But one of the things we're trying to work on is how could we scale this more so that we could share some of this information across a number of different organizations, because I think there's some great learnings, and we don't have to relearn them every time when you're trying to start your own program. And but I can tell you, when you try to sell a health and wellness program in prevention, it's a tough sell. We've tried to do that on the market. And, so I think part of this has to be something that business leaders, that government leaders believe in. And it will take some investment before, you see the longer term results. Thank you.
You talked a little bit about consumerism. My question's around personalized medicine. It used to be that pharma would chase the blockbuster or billion-dollar drug, and now the prevalence of personalized medicine. I'm curious to get your take on how viable do you think that industry is, and how does global pharma produce personalized medicine at scale, and how does that inform your investment decisions?
Sure. In fact, Dr. Peter Slavin and I were just talking about that before we came up here. I think it's an area of great promise, but it's a tough area. And I think that there's probably a little bit, people have leaned a little forward of their skis when we talk about personalized medicine. And, I'm not a pure scientist. I'm sure Jeff could take us into much more detail in this area. But what we, I think, are doing a much better job of now is in 100% of our clinical trials, now molecular diagnostics in some way or biomarkers are being used to better understand and evaluate what's going on. And I mean the basic pathophysiology, but also the response, side effects, all those different parameters. That's part of the drug development process. And the new screening tools that are available are pretty remarkable. And I think the technology that's enabling those kind of diagnostics, the molecular diagnostics and the other types of biomarkers are getting better and better, and the science keeps improving. Directly related to that, however, is also the ability to aggregate all the data. And it's only when you can take all of that, aggregate it, and actually transform that data into meaningful information where we can discriminate between patient types. And one of the best examples I think there is right now is just what's going on in oncology. And the whole shift of thinking of it as a homogeneous disease versus a very heterogeneous disease that's got so many individual characteristics based upon your particular manifestation. And what our scientists would tell you, and Bill Hite, Dr. Bill Hite, who heads up our research and development group, just a wonderful, wonderful scientist and person. What he will tell you is that and I may have some of this math wrong, so if you're a physician, please correct me. By the time the average scan detects, let's say, for example, breast cancer, I believe the nodule might be about 1 millimeter. The cells have probably replicated more than 30 or 40 times by the time you observe that. And it only takes about 4 or 5 more replications for that disease to be fatal. And so imagine if we could get that replication at the second iteration, the third iteration. Imagine if we could intervene and intercept the disease. And that's where I think the combinations of diagnostics along with, in many different types of diagnostics, it could be molecular diagnostics, it can be better screening tools, it could be a number of things, can lead to much better outcomes. And we're also very excited about the potential to use better diagnostics in surgical procedures as well. If we can better understand what the history is, what some of the underlying pathology is, we can take much more targeted approaches to going after that, reduce some of the other morbidity and mortality, and again, and improve and extend lives. So I think it's an incredibly exciting era. If I have time for 1 or 2 more? Yes. Great questions, by the way. You guys are still pretty active after lunch. Must be they switched out that decaf for calf.
Okay, so this is a non-U.S. business question. So you mentioned the aging population in China. Say something about what J&J's business in China and the other parts of the developing world, and with that enormous growth in that market, what do you see as your future there and how you will do business there?
Great question. If you haven't been to China, you should go. It's bigger than life. That's all I can say. I can remember the first time that I went there in the early 90s, and there was like 1 or 2 skyscrapers in Shanghai, and you go back now, and there are 40 more being built, every couple blocks. It's amazing. The way they've urbanized, the way they've advanced. And as a result, of course, our businesses have had to change. We've been in China since the early 80s. It's publicly acknowledged we have about a $3 billion business there. Our largest business is a medical device business. Our second largest business is a consumer business. And our third is our pharma business. We don't participate in the generic market. That's why we don't have as big of a presence there. But what I can tell you, it's changed dramatically. So 20 years ago, our modus operandi for selling in China was you took products from developed markets, you put them into a Chinese package, they had a different price, and then you went out to the market. And that was very successful for a lot of companies for many years. We see more and more of now, though, is a desire to really better understand how the customer needs are different in China versus other parts of the world. Because local manufacturers, local companies are filling those other voids, and it's much more competitive for multinationals like us. So more and more, for example, we're putting an innovation center like we have here in Boston in Shanghai. Because while some of our greatest breakthroughs here have been in areas like laparoscopy surgery, there we know a major issue is lung cancer. The incidence rate of lung cancer due to a number of factors, smoking, the environment, and others in China, is significantly higher based off the proportion of the population that exists in China. So we're trying to use local technology, local insights to say, how can we bring brand new approaches to treating lung cancer in China that at some point we would then export to other parts around the world rather than the other way around. So that's been a big change in our thinking, and more we're doing research and development there that we think ultimately could have some exportability around to other areas. The other thing that you find is that the consumer tastes there too have emerged as they become more and more in the middle class. They want nicer products. They want more global products. Safety and quality are major issues in those. They want natural products. Many of the things that our people want, they're more wired. One other thing that we find is that the channel, in the consumer channel, the percentage of goods that are shipped vis-a-vis the internet versus here, several multiples. And so, I think there's a lot of lessons that we can learn there and apply to the rest of our markets. So we think it remains a big opportunity, but it's very different than operating in some of the traditional ways. Thank you. Probably have time for one more. Yes, sir.
You've mentioned innovation many times, and the U.S. has led the world in life science or healthcare innovation for decades now. People come from all over the world here, a lot of them to Boston for medical treatment. How has the Affordable Care Act affected, and how will that affect innovation in the future, and how do we cultivate that innovation?
Yeah, great question. Look, I think innovation in and of itself, as I mentioned earlier, is going to be critical for the success of healthcare, simply because there's still a lot of unmet medical need and the kind of conditions that I was talking about. If you look at the life expectancy rates, unfortunately, from cancer, if you look at the quality of life issues related to Alzheimer's, if you look at the pandemic that we're going to face in metabolic disease and type 2 diabetes here in the United States, let alone in places like the Middle East, and even now in places like China, if we don't innovate our way to those solutions, even if we contain costs everywhere else, we're going to have a major challenge. So I think innovation is absolutely essential. And I think with the Affordable Care Act, I think that the good news is the first step is what we've seen is we've got people better access to insurance. And I think the fact that it depends on the numbers that you use, that we had as many people either uninsured or underinsured as we had in this country, frankly, is something that we had to address and that we need to address, and it's our responsibility. And I think the Affordable Care Act has gone a long way to doing that. In many ways, while that was a challenge, I think that was the easy part. I think now, when we look at other components of how do we actually get our hands around changing some of the models to just a demand-generated system to one that actually looks at outcomes, that looks at costs more holistically, that has our systems work in a more synchronized and aligned way versus what they currently do. And I think as part of that, everyone's going to have to participate. I think the models will change in integrated delivery networks. I think the models that Jeff and I work with in the pharmaceutical industry, the way reimbursement operates, those things will change. And what I would say is, as we make that change, at the end, we have to keep the patient at the center. And always remember, ultimately, are we doing what's right for the patient? And are we doing it in a way that's safe, that's effective, that's sustainable, economically viable for the long term for the good of our society? And I think that's going to require give and take on everyone's part, every participant. What I can also tell you is that I have the good fortune of seeing healthcare around the world. And there are wonderful systems in Scandinavia, there are wonderful systems in Germany and France and China. I've been in surgical wards in Vietnam and Malaysia. We have a great system when we use it. We got to be able to expand that and make sure everybody can get access to the care that ultimately is available here. And because of the great work that many of you do, the great activity that's taking place in the research and the academic center here in Boston, while it's a big challenge, I remain incredibly optimistic that we're going to figure that out and ultimately do the right thing. And that's what we're here to do. So thank you very much, everybody. I really enjoyed it.